thank you for the invitation and for the entire Fachbereich that you represent. And I think it's also great to be together with Dorothée Billard and Philippe Rekacewicz because what we discuss today is actually our two book projects. I presented those book projects last week, and for those who are here, so these are the books. So if you want to see them, and I will present them briefly, and I have to, of course, repeat a little bit what I said last week, because you need the context, no? So the point is, these are two projects that worked very strongly with maps, but the way how we worked with maps is very different. No. So the procedure is quite different. But of course, certain techniques are very similar. Well, so I start with the first project, Patterns and Pathways of Urbanization, a comparative analysis that we started a long time ago in 2011 in the context of the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore. I don't go into the details here. So that's the book that came out of that, Vocabularies for an Urbanizing Planet. And it is a comparison of 8 large metropolitan regions. And the idea was to conceptualize urbanization processes through this comparison. Now, to make it as compact as possible, so to do that, of course, it is based on fieldwork. It's often critiques that say, yeah, these maps, these are maps of this, they are somehow generalizing maps and so on. So these maps are based on very meticulous fieldwork by our by our researchers who did a great job in analyzing these huge metropolitan regions. So these are very large areas. So the method is basically mobile and multi-sited research. Then there is a process of collective mapping at the beginning of this kind of research and of the entire mapping process. And I can't go into the details here because that would need a lot of time that we don't have. But I start nevertheless with a certain experience, and this experience you see in that picture in the middle on the left side. This is a different project on Havana, and in that project we were confronted with a lack of information. So it was the idea to make a similar analysis as we did with our 8 metropolises, but there the point was that you had really almost no, let's say, useful information for a mapping process. But because that project in Havana was a project that was a kind of a workshop with actually some of the most important planners and architects and urban designers of Havana, so we had a lot of expertise in that group. And we started with mapping workshops, just to have, we started really with, you see that here, we started with mapping on, so we came with a huge, well, at the time this was 2005, we came with a huge Google print of Google Earth. It was very, very new at the time, of Havana, and then we worked on that print. On the urban structure of this city, and the results were amazing. I have some, if you want to learn more about that project, I have another presentation here for today or for tomorrow or whenever. It was an amazing experience. What you can do, even without any kind of hard facts, but just with the facts that people have in their minds, no? And particularly if it's a collective process, you can find out a lot of really great things. Now then, in our work and also in that Havana work, it was a similar process. the idea was to somehow bring down this kind of complexity of these huge urban territories down to some, let's say, 5, 7, 10, 12 major, what we called urban configurations. And that's a process in itself that I also can't explain in detail, but that's, of course, the basis for what you then can map. So to somehow develop, so the researchers, with these mapping processes, these collective mapping processes, with additional field work, with additional information from all sorts of sources, the researchers, they started to develop a kind of a map that shows these different configurations. I will just show that in a minute. And then in that specific project on the vocabularies of an urbanizing planet, we then combined these 8 metropolitan regions, the maps of these 8 metropolitan regions, and started to define urbanization processes. I will explain that in a moment, what we mean with that. But here again, so it's important to see that this is not just a simple, let's say, mechanical comparison. This comparison was the result of about a dozen, 1 to 2 weeks workshops during the entire period of the project. So we were together for about 3 months, all in all, discussing these different metropolitan areas and to try to find out what kind of new urbanization processes, or some of them are really old, but they are not conceptualized so far. How can we somehow distill them out of this comparative process? Now, urbanization processes is a term that is a bit generic. So, but we use this term in a much more let's say, precise way, in a theoretical way. And so here you have a list of existing urbanization processes, suburbanization, very, very broad concept, gentrification, a little bit more specific, but also used for all sorts of situations. Urban informality, a similar, very, very broad kind of concept for a lot of different processes. And we could go on, post-suburbanization, peri-urbanization, and so on. Well, some others, but not very many. So, so our idea was to define processes in a more narrow way, in a more precise way, and that is what we came out of that, out with it. And so all these processes that are listed here, I don't read it now, the list. So these are presented in our book. And I just start with one of them, which is popular urbanization. And that is a process that usually is framed as urban informality, classical informal settlements. But we made quite some distinctions. So we differentiated between several of those so-called informality processes. And so this one that we called popular urbanization, the term that comes from the Latin American discussion, and of course is strongly also framed by this experience in Latin America where people really construct their own houses. So in the case of Mexico City, which is on the left here, above, so people really construct their own houses, they construct their own neighborhoods with their own hands. It's very important. How can you do that? And you can imagine that needs a lot of preconditions. It needs the land that must be available. It needs also organization. So it needs groups that are organized, that do this process together. And so it is not something that happens all over the world. It's something that happens under specific circumstances. And we looked on 2 other processes. One is in Istanbul, here on the left down, the process of gecekondu production, which is very well, you can very well compare it with the situation in Mexico City, and a similar process, but very different, in Lagos. And I see that I'm already running out of time. So what we did now is so here you have the map of Mexico City. And I can't go into all the details, but what you see in the center is this blue, this light blue and this darker blue around it. And these two areas together form these areas of popular urbanization. And the other colors, these are different processes that I can't explain now because of lack of time, but just that you get an idea. Now, this is the situation in Mexico City. The situation in Istanbul is much more complex because there is a transformation going on of this Gecekondu area. But here, if you look on this kind of blue-green kind of area, you see that almost the entirety of, 80% about of the territory of Istanbul was constructed as Gecekondu areas. They then also transformed into different areas and different processes, but the basis is this kind of huge area. So you see that this kind of popular urbanization processes, they were basic and substantial processes for both metropolises. In Lagos, that people say, yeah, of course, this is informal urbanization there. But you see, Lagos is green, and that's a different process. We call that plotting urbanism, which I can't explain, but this piecemeal, step-by-step process, much more, it's not a collective process, it's an individualized process. It has to do with also with market kind of mechanisms. And there is a little bit of purple here on very marginalized areas, precarious areas. There is what we would call popular urbanization. So you see here the mapping process becomes already key to understand that. So the dimensions and the structure of these processes. Second one is a process that we called multi-layered patchwork urbanization, and that's a process that brings together places here in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in Paris, and in Los Angeles. And here, starting with Tokyo, again, you see how we constructed these maps. So you have different colors. Each color represents another process. And so this kind of blue-green process here is multi-layered patchwork urbanization in Tokyo. And that's, when we go to Paris, we see here, so you still have the Tokyo situation, so here we can isolate it. If you go to Paris, this process, again, in red-green, in blue-green, is much more dominant, and it somehow covers almost all the outskirts of Paris. We call that the banlieue, but the banlieue lointain, no, the Grande Couronne in French. So almost all that is kind of multi-layered patchwork urbanization. Now you ask why we call that like that. So it's multi-layered, so there are several layers overlapping each other, not somehow deleting each other, but they stay in place. But there is kind of an addition of processes, and that gives, at the end, it gives a patchwork character to these areas. And so I can't go through the entire definition, but the effect in Paris is that if you drive through this zone, you really don't know what comes around the next corner. No, so you go around the corner, and then you might have a massive housing estate. You might have a post kind of modern type of centrality. You might have all sorts of single family houses. It is a very, very chaotic, in the experience, a very chaotic kind of pattern. But it has a logic. It is patch by patch. It gives a patchwork at the end. And so here you see what happens if we just use only this kind of process on the map, so this is a way how to figure that out and how to work it out of the map. And Dorothée Billard will, after me, explain the kind of the design process in detail. Similar thing in Los Angeles, but here it's a very different situation. So this is this area, and to show that clearer here. So here we have actually a central area for Los Angeles, huge central area, and then a huge area of patchwork, of multi-layered patchwork urbanization that was described by Edward Socha under the label of this kind of postmodern type of metropolis that he explained. Exopolis, he called it at the time. And so you see also the relationship with the centrality. So these kind of areas are strongly related to a kind of also a patchwork of centralities. They have a specific relationship to these centralities. And that's the situation in the Pearl River Delta. And here is particularly, we look at this area, which is in Hong Kong, an area that is somehow in the sandwich between Hong Kong proper, the concentrated area, and the area across the border in so-called mainland China in Shenzhen. And more about that you will get from the explanations you will get by Dorothée Billard. Now, two final slides. So the other project, Territories of Extended Urbanization, resulted in this book. Now, the only thing I explain here is extended urbanization. And to make it very simple, these are urbanization processes beyond the metropolis, okay? Beyond this. So if we would continue our analysis of Tokyo or of the Pearl River Delta or what else, so we would find then such kind of areas that are transformed by processes of extended urbanization, which are not concentrated, but which are dispersing over the territory. I talked a lot about that last week. And here, the mapping process is very different, because here, Philippe Rekacewicz basically made the maps together with the researchers. So this was a cooperation of the individual researchers and Philippe to produce appropriate maps to somehow not only illustrate, but even construct these processes. Okay, thank you very much. And sorry for that, I needed so much that. Okay.
Yeah, so hello, everybody. I'm Dorothée Billard, and now I want to talk about the design process of the maps. Christian already said a lot about the project, so we start working together also with Philippe Rekacewicz. We start working at these 8 maps, and these 8 maps, the main maps, let's say, are extremely complex, and they have a very high density of information. So we thought, in addition to these 8 maps, it would be very interesting to have a series of maps which could show and compare specific processes between the concerned cities. So I will show 2 examples: the so-called MULAPA, multi-layered patchwork urbanization, and also maps, the series about the mass housing. And for each, I will go in one example more deep, and to explain the visual problematic, because I'm graphicer and artist, so I work on visual matters, and so that's also the way I will try to explain you what the questions, how the questions by the design have been, and so how it came to the final maps. So we have in the multi-layered patchwork urbanization, we have this 4 cities: Paris, Los Angeles, Pearl River Delta, and Tokyo, as Christian already explained. And what they have in common for my part, for the graphic part, is they have all this MULAPA, this blue area, has always a certain distance from the center. And they have, yes, as you also said, heterogeneous layers of activities, and they all include somehow some local and specific centralities. So I'm going to speak about Paris. And for these maps, the main material was, of course, always the material of the main map we worked on. So here it's about this light blue area. I want now to make a map just only about to focus on this specific configuration. So I begin with the footprint, which is the basement of all the maps. Like the bottom, it's so what is built and what is not built. And then I add the network of roads, which in the case of Paris, it's very important and also very specific because it has a lot to do with Paris and with this historic centrality of Paris. And then I add the old centralities. There are three, of course, Paris itself in the middle. And then here in the west side, Versailles, which was an historic centrality, but also today quite important as a symbolic place for power and for capital also. And then Saint-Denis, which was also an important city in the monarchy, and which is today the second city in the Paris area for the population. In terms of population. And then I add the new centralities, which are much specific, new ones like La Défense, business part, the airport, logistic hubs, new towns. And then last one, this Moulapa, this blue area we defined as the multi-layered patchwork urbanization. And well, later, I will add more layers, but for now, we should be able, because we have all the main elements, so we should be able to see what the map is about. And for some reason, it doesn't really work for me. I mean, I can say with very simple words what the map is about. It is about the blue and the red. It is about how the blue is related to different qualities of red. And that's not exactly what we see, because we have in between, we have this gray area. And the gray area is the footprint, so it's an information we really need. We cannot get rid of it. And I cannot make it lighter. I would lose the shape of the whole thing if I didn't have it. And let's say the footprint in gray, it's a factual information. It's a quantitative information. It's like a 0-1 switch. It's about what is built and not. And the other two colors, the red and the blue, are quantitative information and qualitative. I say it the wrong way, like qualitative. It's about the quality of space, of urban space. So these areas, the blue and the red, they had properties as defined by the research. And so we have two levels of information, the qualitative and quantitative, and we are treating them the same way. And that is a problem, because what does it mean to go from this blue area, which has some properties and has a color, to the gray area, which has no property, but still a color? It doesn't make any sense. So, and on top of that, at that point, I have to say I feel also concerned about this topic, because I spent myself half of my life in Paris, and I can describe it very good on the map. I was born in the red, in the big one. And then I grew up in the gray, and I spent 15 years in the blue. And living in the blue, I've been always working and studying in the red, which means every day back into the red. So thinking about this experience, I came to the point that the problem of the map is the representation of the centrality of Paris itself. Because we have here several red dots. They are, of course, they are different in the shape and the size and the shadow, in the shade, but Paris is just only one of many. And of course, Paris is the biggest one, but it's not that big because Paris is a quite small city. And I cannot make it bigger, and I cannot make it double red. And even if I could, I mean, for me, Paris in terms of centrality is more a black hole than a red dot. Something is not really correct in that representation for me. Or I can say it with other words. It's not about, the question of the centrality is not about being in the red or not. The question is that wherever you are on the map, which also means wherever you are on the French territory, you are related to that point. And you are related culturally, politically, economically, and so on. So what does it mean? Well, for French people, it means a lot because we have to struggle with that all the time. But for the map, it means that we need an element more. We need an element that would suggest a sort of something like a very strong magnetic field. So I go back to the footprint, and I came up to the idea that I try to convert it into a radial pattern. And this was the first draft. Of this idea, but I think it's already a quite powerful image because it gives us the idea of the centrality. But of course, we don't want to have this on the top of the map because it's one. We don't want more information. Christian was upset about no, please, not one information more. We have enough, but I thought that's true. We don't need one information on top. We need one information on like a background information, like a structure. So yeah, that's the way it looks. And then I add the other layers. Yes, that's it. And so now we don't have, we have this gray element, this pattern that structures the background. And I think it's an important point because in this topic of multiple layer patchwork organization, it's a lot about, as you say also, the relationship between this area and some kind of centrality. So the question of the centrality is very important. So the question was also for me, how can I apply this idea to the other maps? Here for Los Angeles, of course, it was quite logical to have an orthogonal pattern and to place also to make all the centralities fit in that pattern. And then for the Pearl River Delta, we have three radial patterns because the map is structured by the three centralities. And here also in that case, the pattern, this radial pattern is very discrete. It's not information on top, it's somewhere in the bottom, in the background. And here for Tokyo, we have also a radial pattern with a very nice with the coast. I mean, it's more like a half circle. Yes, that's it for this one. Now, I want to show another series of three maps about the mass housing urbanization. So about Paris, Mexico City, and Hong Kong. And the three maps are about, well, it's about territorial strategies for the production of housing in a very large scale. So it's the first one is Paris in the 70s and 80s. So the map is 1982, and we have basically these dark blue circles and also some other shapes, light blue one and purple one. So we have different shapes and different, let's say, different entities, different administrative entities and in settings for this mass housing. And they are all related to the centralities, of course. So the red ones, and they're also related to the industry, which is also a kind of pattern. I don't know if you see it in as like this brown pattern, which represents the industry because the mass housing had, of course, also a lot to do with the industrial pattern. Which is quite important. The size of these dots and of these of these dots are not they represent the surface of the areas. So it's the impact on the footprint. It's not the population. It was a very important point by these maps. We will see it also here in Mexico City. Here it's more about mass housing urbanization. It's outside, or it's quite far from the city center. And there are small houses, very huge pattern of small houses. And what is very important here, I choose a hexagonal pattern to represent them. And what is very important is the relation to the transport, because there is, let's say, no relation to the transport. There's a completely lack of infrastructure by these areas. And then the third map, it's Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, we have these small dots here, the blue one. And these areas, on each of these dots, it's an area with several huge towers. And these areas are related to the land fields. We here have in yellow, so it's land which is, let's say, how to extend the territory. They only can extend on water side. And then also related to the public transport, which are the red lines here. And so I felt also we have a problem, because the representation is correct. Yeah, I choose for all the three maps, I choose the surface, the impact on the footprint. But now we get the feeling that, well, this one doesn't feel like mass housing. And when I compare it with Mexico, I see the dots in Hong Kong are too small. Like, it feels like, of course, it's not about representation of population or density, but I feel like there are much more people living in the periphery of Mexico City than in Hong Kong, which is, of course, nonsense. And so that's, for me, a very important thing by visual matters, because you have to trust your eyes. And how do these patterns look like? Well, in Mexico, it looks quite brutal and repetitive, which is quite exactly how I want it to look like. And for Hong Kong, it looks tiny and cute and disorganized, which is not really possible, because the reality we're talking about is this one. So, yeah, so what should we do here? But I have to say, I really like, especially like the moment when having a problem in the reality and trying to visualize it, you become exactly the same problem in the representation as in the reality. And that's here also the point. Like in Hong Kong, how is it possible to have so many people living on such a small surface? And for the map, how is it possible to represent that density of information on a single sheet of paper? So in such a case, it's sometimes helpful to look at the solution adopted in the reality and try to adapt it. So in that case of Hong Kong, of course, it means escaping the ground floor. So that's what we did here. And we had a database with a number of towers for each dot. So we didn't want to represent the population, but only the towers. So like half a centimeter is one tower. So I start to stacking the towers. And so it's kind of hybrid format. You know, it's both, it's a map and a bar graph. And so let's say an axonometry. And it's also an exception in the maps, in the three maps, because it's the only one that's not only showing the horizontal impact, but also the vertical impact. So last picture, the comparison of the three maps. And yes, we were starting with the same graphic concept, and then we had to adapt it, but I think it works well. Thank you very much.
My turn. Hi, everybody. Then now we are going to switch a little bit on the epistemology. We discussed the challenge to mix temporal and spatial dimension and aspect of all the phenomena and processes that happens in the reality and transform this into a map, which is complex. It's a challenge, but it is also a challenge to speak about this spatiality and temporality within 15 minutes or so. So I'll try to do my best to not go over the time. So we go back to the level of epistemology, and then behind what Dorothée said, there is, we have applied a number of protocols, methods, and approach in cartography, and this is what I will try to summarize. So the purpose of this short communication today will be, on the one hand, to outline the thinking we've been implementing on alternative cartographic practices that could possibly answer to the questions that we had during the project, but also the questions that was in your scientific argument. What challenges occur for integrating time and space into mapping protocols? And how can multiple simultaneous temporalities be spatialized in mapping? So we play between temporalities and spatialities, and we had, like, for 10 years we've been working together, had to solve the problem with a concept that has been evaluating and transformed through time. On the second hand, I will also try to present few examples, few concrete cartographic solutions that we think can provide something in addition to the narrative to help people to discover the world, the processes, all what happens in the field, in the territory, that are usually very complicated to describe in words, and which is possibly possible to make visible on the map. In other words, to produce a cartography, a drawing, a visual representation with, beyond being a mere illustration of the text, is a drawing representation of the world that claims to become by itself a real contribution to knowledge. So there is this constant dialogue between the image and the text. The image responds to the text responds to the image. The image is not an illustration of the text, but it brings the knowledge by itself independently. So it's, we're trying to implement this, as it was pretty new and difficult to implement, also to make understanding people which are not used to the mapping processes, that the maps is bringing, because it highlights things which are invisible to the eyes or invisible in the text, and suddenly becomes clear because this is map. So we speak about multidimensionality. Of course, drawing the world is a challenge, we know, as we have to represent it the clearest way possible, a multiple superimposition of facts and processes. That is really complex, to handle dozens and dozens of objects at the same time and articulate them in a meaningful way. Now, radical mapping is before all rendering a vision of places, location, space, vision of the world, territory, not as it is really, but as we see it. And this is making a great difference, because we don't map the reality. We will see what we are mapping, something which is different. It's the way we see the reality. And there is a huge difference. You said earlier that the maps are based on a very meticulous fieldwork. But if we had to map all what we brought from the field on the map, it would be completely ununderstandable. So we have to go through a process of generalization, synthesizations. And this is the frustrations, because you get rid of information. You have to collect it. And this is maybe the challenge also, to accept this idea, and we try to see this in few of those examples. So when we speak about multidimensionality, this is important, and I try to figure it out here, what was leading us through those 10 years of work. There is, of course, two main dimensions. The spatiality, because we are mapping the space, and on this space, it happens things through times. So you have the two, this temporal and spatial dimension, which is very important. And I will add two, which were very important for us. The first one is the verticality, because as Dorothée said, it happens something above and below. For example, Hong Kong, or megalopole like New York or any others, where you have this life above the sky almost, We have to find solutions to represent, and we are not still yet there. But there is also below. The example is Montreal, for example, where you have an underground life. You can really go from a kilometer through gallery, and this life is underground, so it plays with this vertical dimension. Another way, territory which is more or less urbanized in conflict, this is the West Bank, for example, where Ariel Sharon, since 2005, helped by Dani Tirza, he's a colonel, he's a settler. They have organized a system where the settlers drive and circulate above, and the Palestinians circulate in tunnels. So they cross each other in many places, but the Palestinians, they are 10 meters below, or 5 or 10 meters below. So you have here also, for the first time, a vertical border, and you have to integrate the verticality into the pattern. And this is a way of urbanization, of course. So this is this duality with these two additional mentions between the reality and the imaginary. So maps always takes out from, I forgot to speak about the imaginary, that's the fourth one, and this is also important, and it symbolizes the fact that we map what we think we see, but we map, if we put 10 geographers in front of a landscape, you would have something different. So it's really a question of interpretation. First, because we can't put everything on it, so we have to process the huge amount of data that we collect from the field into something which is understandable, but also because we interpret phenomena, we interpret processes, and we are not necessarily agree on what happens, although there is compromise, but there is also this always this uncertainty, this dimension, which I would call imaginary. And this is why I used to say that the map we produce is a permanent dialogue between the reality and the imaginary, and there is a back and forth, a ping pong in between the two. And also, beyond the fact that it's a representation of the world, I consider personally the result as a social and political act. So we are now in a situation where what we have done, we have processed and produced and created maps which represent a certain level of the reality, but they are more a political act rather than a representation of what we want, because we have created concepts, the Mulapart, etc., and then we have also reorganized the space so that it's understandable for the lay audience. Now I want to speak a little bit on the sensorial and experimental aspect of this cartography that we have also tried to experiment. And this is where we speak about being outside and inside. We offer a vision from the outside. Usually that's the conventional way of mapping. We are outside and we map situations, but we are missing a lot of emotions, of experience. And then we wish to contribute a little bit, to distance ourselves from the humanity, from the human being, and try to get a little bit more insight to imagine the space. And to map it from inside means try to map not only the factual elements, but also the feelings we have of the field, the experience we have had. Again, you said meticulous field work, we get informations, and the information is feeling. So it's not only that we see objects, but it's the impression we have. We get scared from a place, we love a place, we like this perspective. We consider it as toxic, we don't feel good. How do you represent love? How do you represent hate? What is the visual representation modes of all this? What symbol, what color? And it's really, it's not factual, but it's virtual, I would say. So 3 things. First, we find under the name of radical, critical, alternative, participative, collective, mental, emotional, sensorial mapping. All this I would regroup into the terms of experimental mapping, or even newly experiential mapping or creative mapping. And it means that it involves how we interpret the place, what we feel about the place, in addition of what is factually we have observed. A building, a tower, it's there, and we put it there, this is factual. But there is many more that happens about this. The second thing, the making of these sensorial maps involves also the use of all our senses. and feelings. It's not only the sight of visions, but it's also the noise, hearing, audition, the smell, possibly, the touch, tactician, and eventually, why not, taste or gustations, you never know. But all this participates to the way we experience the place. And we collect the data, information based on our perception, emotions, interpretation, experience. And this is why there is this new discipline called experiential mapping. This is really very new. You have in the Netherlands and in Norway some universities, they have project research on experiential mapping. This is, I'm not sure exactly what's the difference with experimental mapping, but it's there. So we just have to watch. Now, I would like to go through a few of the examples that illustrate the purpose. Anyway, what you are going to see, those experimental experiential mapping, they are playing the game. I would not say against the conventional maps, but it's really attempt. We say experimental because we try things, and we try representation mode. And if it doesn't work, we give up and we try something else. The first one I would like to depict is one I saw yesterday in the Futurarium here in Berlin. Is a representation. There is a map in one of the setup. I don't know if you have been there, which is representing a visual complexity, which is the migration. So this one is extremely interesting, although it looks like rather conventional, because it represents all kind of migration put together, not only refugees, but also economic migrants and partly also business trips, etc. Because it's killing one preconceived idea that there is a wave of migrants from the south and from the east invading the civilized world, Western world. And then you say there is waves threatening our civilization. So I looked at the sources. I look at how they were working. It's extremely serious. You have 10 sources. You have 15 references. So, and known. I was working on migration for 15 years. And then it kills this completely. The largest movements, this is firstly in Asia, and it's internal in China with the neighboring country, in Europe, and a little bit less in North America. But from Africa to Europe, from Middle East to Europe, this is nearly nothing. So when you change the perspective and you take the numbers, there is no threat whatsoever. But we knew that very well. Like you say, even if 2 million people try to go in Europe, it's 0.5% of the population. It's neutral, and it's even good for us because for the social security we will have more money if they come and if they work. So. The map is that also, killing preconceived idea or deconstructing discourses. That's the first one I wanted to, and the representation is conventional, but the intention is radical. To be radical doesn't necessarily need that you have to do something extremely original or sexy. The conventional way of representing the world with the normal point, line, and surfaces, the three fundamental elements conceptualized by Kandinsky in 1926, is absolutely enough, or if you have this intention. Now we go to something a little bit more radical, or let's say critical. This is the way we represent the interaction between places. How we represent superimpositions. What are our solutions for superimpositions of movement, spatiality, and temporality? And I felt really when I looked at your scientific argument that my all concerns and all research that was last year is really fit very well to this, with desperately trying to find solutions. And we have to remain modest. I'm not absolutely sure that we are there anyway. So the first one is a global representation. How to represent? So this is taken from the extended urbanization project. It's projects by one of our researchers, Metachia, and she was working on the small regions, mid in Peloponnese, to see how this outside urbanizations beyond the metropole was working. And she was particularly interested to map, to understand what was the link between Arcadia and the rest of the world. And that was so complex that we have been working, as you see, with many drafts. Before a map, there is many drafts, draft 0 to draft 10 to draft 15, until you get convinced that the form you have found is good. And then we ended up to a machinery. It's a little bit like Nikit Sinfal. We are inspired by the artist. Where you have Arcadia, and with the colors, with the thickness of the lines, we have figured out all the relationships that Arcadia was extremely tightly related to the world. First, they receive money from the European Union, you see on the field. First, they receive money from the IMF. They have migrants, Greek migrants that goes to Germany, and they come back in a pendling system, also from Australia. There is those weekly pendulum between Athens and Arcadia when they come back from the weekend, plus the tourists, etc. We had no time to go further. I guess you can find those documents in the book or in the internet. This is one of the solutions, and these solutions is a little bit disconnected from the space, but it's a base for discussion. If we take only the temporal aspect, we were trying to understand who is coming and when in these regions. You have the local populations, they are stable. There is the tidal inhabitants. So they come in summer and they leave for the winter. The tourists, the students, the harvesters, and all kinds of populations that superimpose, that comes back and forth. And we also try to figure this out to really understand if there was some moment where everybody was there and some moments where nobody was there, or some of the kind. And this is for urban planning and for the infrastructures rather important to understand this, and we have also to find a way for doing this. And at the end, so this one is spatial, and this one becomes spatial. And this is exactly the same thing as the one I showed before. And it shows the movement, the spatiality, the temporality, the superimpositions of how you use the land and how you produce the land in a way that is the most understandable possible. These superimpositions is pretty difficult to put together. And of course, there is a draft that we have to do before. I will finish by saying that you have seen here that we have transformed the territory into a model. So from the real map, from the conventional map, we decided for most of the project to turn over something much more conceptual, much more simplified. I said it's a frustration, we lose some information, but we better understand the processes. 17 minutes, I will stop here because we have conversations. I had many more to show you, of course. That's always like that, but thank you very much.